I'm Scott Walker and this is Walks on the Wild Side. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to draw attention to your subject in wildlife photography. What's the right aperture to use and what alternatives do you have to adjusting your aperture? Welcome back to Walks on the Wild Side, the channel where I help you capture the beauty of nature through your lens. Recently, people have been asking for the settings that I use in the photos that I display in these videos, and the last couple of videos that I've put out, I've included these settings. So I thought, let's talk about camera settings, and in particular, we'll talk about aperture, which I think has more myths about it than most other settings. So I'm going to start off talking about what aperture is and how it's used, and move on to describe the effect that it can have and help you produce the type of photos that you want to produce. And I'm going to finish by talking about some alternatives to aperture, because there are other, sometimes better ways to draw attention to your subject than simply by having a wide open aperture. Now, if you are a newer photographer, I'd recommend that you watch the video in full. If you're more advanced, you may want to skip on to some of the later parts. And if you have a look in the video description below, I've included some chapters that will allow you to click on the relevant parts that you want to view. So firstly, what is aperture? The aperture is the opening at the front of your lens which lets light in. It can be widened to let more light in, or narrowed. And when we speak about shooting wide open, we mean shooting at the widest aperture your lens has. It can be controlled by you when using manual mode, usually M on your settings dial, or aperture priority mode, which is A or AV. When you photograph your subject, the plane of focus, which is the part of the photo which is perfectly in focus, is always parallel to your camera's sensor. Either side of it, there is an area which is acceptably in focus, and this is called the depth of field. This is controlled by the aperture, but also other choices such as the distance away from the subject and the type of lens that you're using. When you want to widen the aperture, you lower the f number or f-stop on the aperture dial. A wide aperture has a shallower depth of field, more out of focus, it lets more light in, and that usually means you need to increase your shutter speed. When you narrow the aperture, you use a higher f-stop, and a narrow aperture has a wider depth of field, less out of focus areas, it lets less light in, which means you normally have to lower your shutter speed. And how will aperture affect the type of photos that you want to take? Now here's three examples. Here's a mallard. It's at a fairly wide aperture of f6.3. Almost all of the photo is out of focus except for the bird and a small amount of water either side of it. What created the blur here was the technique, which is covered in my waterfowl video, and I've linked that above and in the description below. Here is a little egret. It was shot at a fairly narrow aperture of f10. I photographed it whilst making my waders video, but I didn't include it because an egret isn't a wader. But I wanted to juxtapose this beautiful, delicate bird against that mass of thick, dirty mud on the mud flats of the wash. To make sure that the mud had a fairly visible texture, I chose a narrow aperture. Here is a young cormorant. I photographed it on a pontoon at the edge of a lake. It was taken with a much wider aperture than you would normally see in wildlife photos of f3.2, and that's because I used a short telephoto lens at 75mm rather than a super telephoto lens that you would normally use for wildlife. I had to gradually inch closer to the bird to get as near as about 8 or 9 feet away. There's some really nice blur and bokeh here, but it's not as much out of focus as the mallard, even though the mallard is at a much narrower aperture. And the reason for this is the choice of lens. Technique and choices have as much to do with how much out of focus area is in your photo as the aperture does. So what is the right aperture for wildlife photography? Well, many people will tell you you need to shoot wide open. I don't agree with that. I've seen countless videos here on YouTube, read blogs, websites and so on that all say you need to shoot wide open. In fact, many people advocate that you only get the best wildlife photography if you get a prime large lens, something like a 600mm f4. But that lens on the Sony setup, for example, costs £12,000, and I can't imagine that there's many people who have that lens. And you can achieve great things without having a 600mm f4 prime, and you don't have to shoot wide open. In fact, I shoot wide open very infrequently. So my go-to settings tend to be f8 and f9, and I will adjust up or down accordingly. The reason for this is that f8 is the sweet spot for sharpness on most camera lenses, and I would take sharpness over a wide aperture any day. I also use f9 quite a lot because I like to swap in and out my 1.4 teleconverter, and by using the 1.4 teleconverter you lose one stop of light. So keeping my camera on f9 means that I don't have to worry about adjusting the ISO or the shutter speed when I add that teleconverter on. I can just stay at f9 and keep the settings that I had been using before I put the teleconverter on. When I'm taking portraits of wildlife, I tend to like photos that have got a background that's blurred out a little bit, but not too much. And here's a good example of that, a jay. So the jay and its perch are in focus, but the background isn't. However, there's enough colour variation that you can infer a lot. It was taken in early autumn, so there's a nice variety of colours in the out of focus areas. You can see pinks and greens and yellows, reds and oranges, and it really adds something to the picture without distracting from the jay. So having a background which is blurred out and reduces the effect of some of those things that are in the background, so it doesn't distract from your subject but instead complements it, is a great thing to have. But you don't need a wide aperture to achieve that. Thinking about how to position yourself so that the background is at least twice the distance from the subject that you are from it will give you the kind of effect that you see in this jay photo. So now that we've talked about aperture and understood how to use it, I want to give you some alternatives to think about for when you're out and about doing your photography. So things that you may want to choose to do so that you don't have to shoot wide open to draw attention to your subject. And for many of these tips, I'll give you examples of where I've used both a wider aperture and a narrower aperture to achieve the effect. And the first one I want to talk about is thinking, do you even need to have any background blur at all? A few days ago, I was out taking photographs of urban peregrine falcons. And these amazing birds, it's the fastest bird on the planet. They will nest high up in buildings around towns and cities. And if you're photographing something in an urban environment, you want to draw attention to the fact that it's in a town or a city. So if you just photograph it in the sky or against some trees, it could look like it's in the countryside and you'd have no idea that it's an urban bird. So you want to make sure that the buildings are in the picture. But the problem with that is that when the birds are so close to the building, you can't blur them out because the bird is many times the distance from you that it is from the building. So you might as well embrace it and go for a narrow aperture. So here's an example of one of the shots that I got. And this peregrine was just diving from the building and it was shot at f10, so it's fairly well in focus throughout, and it really draws attention to the fact that this bird is in an urban environment. An even better example of this is the winner of this year's Wildlife Photographer of the Year. Sergey Gorshov, I'll put his name here, and I would recommend that you Google this photograph. Took a picture of a tiger seeming to hug a tree. And it was at the edge of a woodland, and pretty much everything in the photo is in focus. It's an absolutely beautiful photo and a very touching moment, and a well worthwhile winner of Wildlife Photographer of the Year. So if the winner of Wildlife Photographer of the Year can do so without having blurred elements in his picture, why do you need them? Why does anybody need them? Why do people give the advice that you have to shoot wide open? So moving on from photos where nothing is out of focus to a photo where everything is out of focus, I want to talk about a style of photography that I've increasingly used over the last couple of years, and that's where there's total blur from front to back except for your subject. And this can be achieved both with a wide and a narrow aperture. So first, I'm going to give you an example of a kestrel photograph that I took. And there's a bit of a story to this photograph. So I was shooting inside some trees with my back against the trunk, shooting towards the outer part of the branches where some small birds were landing, and I was getting a nice effect of some dark surroundings with a bright background and these small birds being backlit. But then I noticed 2 trees along from me, a kestrel landed, and it wasn't distracted by me at all. In fact, I think it was trying to hide from something else, because normally when you see a kestrel in a tree, they're fairly high up, looking down on the ground for some prey. But this time it wasn't, it landed on a really low branch. So I knew that if I turned towards the kestrel, I could get a photo. And as I looked at it, I didn't particularly like the photo I was about to take. The background wasn't great. There were some real bright spots with some blurred out branches. There was a lot of contrast in it. And I knew that this photo just needed something a little bit extra. So as I was aiming towards the kestrel, I realised that if I just lowered myself a little bit, the tree between me and the kestrel had a branch that I could blur out in front of the bird. So this meant there was complete blur from front to back of the photo, apart from the kestrel itself. And I'm really pleased with this. I think it's a lovely photo. But if it didn't have that foreground blur of the branch, it wouldn't be as good. Now, it wasn't the aperture that made that photo. It was my eyes and my mindset. So think about those kind of things when you're looking to get total blur in your pictures. Another example here is of a rabbit, and this was taken at a much narrower aperture. It was shot at f14, but it's exactly the same effect as the kestrel, which by the way was shot at f6.3. Now, the reason it was at f14 was that I was a long distance, so I had to put my 2x teleconverter on, and you lose 2 stops of light. So things are a lot less blurry in that situation. But even so, I positioned myself on the ground so that there were lots of clumps of grass between me and the rabbit, and it meant I could blur out not only the background behind the rabbit, but all of the foreground in front of it. In fact, there's everything blurred out in this picture except for the rabbit and an annoying blade of grass on the right-hand side. And to be fair, I could have taken out that blade of grass in Photoshop, but I don't mind it. I think it adds something to the picture. But there is an example of getting total blur front to back whilst using a narrow aperture. Next, let's talk about another way to bring attention to your subject, and that's through the use of framing. And what we mean by that is having things around the edge of the photograph that put your subject in a frame. So here's a photo of a gold crest, and it's sitting in a yew tree, and there are lots of yew tree branches around it from other trees, and I've framed the bird with parts of those yew tree branches poking in from the outside. Now there is a good distance to the background here, and I could have used a much wider aperture, but I shot at f14, and the reason for that was because I needed it so that those framing parts of the yew trees around the edges weren't completely out of focus. If I'd got this at something like f7 or even lower, then it could have been so out of focus that those framing yew trees became bokeh balls, which may have been a nice effect, but when I tried it, I didn't like it. So I wanted to get a much narrower aperture so that the framing was much more obvious. Another great way to complement your subject without distracting from it is to find an extraordinary background. And what I mean by that is some kind of background that's not just the usual blurred out leaves. So here's two examples. One was shot with a slightly wider aperture and one with a slightly narrower aperture, but it's the same effect. And the first one is a gannet. And this gannet was shot very early in the morning, slightly after sunrise, and the sun is just glistening off the sea in the background, making all those lovely bokeh balls. And it doesn't distract from the gannet, but it just adds a level of beauty to this photo, which is really nice. And the second example here is of a tern, and this was from my recent terns video. And I shot this during really heavy rain. And the rain adds something a little bit different to many of the other photos that I got that day. But this was shot with a narrower aperture at f9. So it's not the aperture that creates the effect, it's being in the position to get your subject with some kind of extraordinary background, something that's a little bit different from the norm. And just as I'm talking about rain, now it starts raining. But whilst we're talking about rain, let's talk about some other weather effects that can really bring attention to your subjects. And mist and fog is the photographer's best friend. I think all styles of photography, all genres, benefit from having a little bit of mist and fog in their photos. And here's two examples. One of these is of a grey squirrel running over a fence. And this is actually a composite of a burst of shots. So I photographed the grey squirrel throughout its journey along the fence and then pieced them together afterwards in Photoshop. So that in itself is quite a nice effect. But what really adds to this photo is the background fog. So behind the fence that the squirrel is running along, there's some lovely fog with some beautiful backlit lighting, and you can just see the trees starting to emerge out of the background in the fog. And that really does add something to this photograph. Very similar, here is of a young stag, and this was shot first thing in the morning on a very foggy day, but it had really clear skies, which meant that that golden hour orange light was really bright. And I chose an aperture for this specifically in order to get those trees in the background. So the trees, again, are just starting to emerge through the fog. But if I'd used a wider aperture, what would have happened here is that they would have just been completely blurred out. And imagine this photo, if you will, where the background is just one uniform colour and you don't see the tops of those trees. It just wouldn't be as good. This photo is brought to life because of the mist and fog, not because of the aperture. Now, when you're photographing birds with water as a background, I'd like to ask you to pay real attention to the light that's on the water. Looking at the pond just behind me, as I skim my camera across it, you can see that there are lighter patches and darker patches where the sky is reflected in the water or the trees are reflected in the water. And there might be other things around the pond that cause those light and dark reflections, such as cliff faces and rocks. But this can really help because the lighter areas will help give the impression of out of focus. So even though it's the exposure which is removing the detail from the water, not your aperture. So here's an example I took of a grey-lag goose, and on this pond that I was photographing, I had to be looking down at the birds because there was a steep bank leading down to it. I couldn't get down to water level. So I chose to particularly photograph birds that were flying over the light patches of pond because I could use the effect that I've just described. So as the goose flew towards me, I fired off a burst of shots, and luckily the goose happened to drop off a load, if you like, in the pond, which added something a little bit different to this photo. But getting back to drawing attention to the goose, what did it in this circumstance was the use of light rather than a wide aperture. And here's a similar example of a puffin that was on a cliff face and it had got a very dark sea behind it. Now, I'm going to show you a burst of photos that I took. As I saw a wave approaching, I knew that it would change the colour in the background behind the bird. So I fired off a burst of shots and waited for the wave to be at the point it was behind the puffin. So here you can see it's gradually getting lighter and lighter till the wave hits, and that's the photo that I chose, rather than have the darker photo, which just looked a little muddy behind the bird. So again, thinking about using light to draw attention to your subject rather than relying on aperture. Now the final tip is to think about the aspect ratio or cropping, and most cameras will allow you to change the aspect ratio in camera. So you could go for a 1:1, a 4:3, a 2:3, or even something wider like a 16:9. And if you can't do that in your camera, or you want to do it afterwards, you can always do it in your photo editing software. But using crop can allow you to bring some focus to your subject. And here's a photo I've shown before, but I really quite like. It's of a grey seal bull, and I've zoomed right into his face and used a 1:1 aspect ratio. And this meant that all of the distraction on either side of his face is lost. So I'm just focused on him. There's literally nothing else in the picture. And this is really nice because normally when we take photos of grey seal bulls, it's of them charging around a beach, beating up other bulls for the right to mate with females. But this one, you kind of get a sense of some personality. You can see into his eyes and get a feel for this bull, which is really nice. And it's the aspect ratio that's made this photo. It's absolutely nothing to do with aperture. And another example of using a crop was recently when I was on the Wash photographing waders. Now, as I was doing so, and that tide was at its highest point, almost at my feet, a tiny little dunlin flew in and landed maybe 6 feet from me. And I gradually got down low so that I could be almost at the same level as it. But the background was such that I couldn't get a larger distance between the bird and the background than between me and the bird. So I had to choose what to do. There were a lot of distractions around the edge as well. So I chose in this circumstance to go for a square crop. Now it's not the best photo in the world, and because of that I didn't even include it in my waders video when I published that a few weeks ago. But I do quite like it as an example that demonstrates how crop or aspect ratio can take away some of that distraction around the edges. So there you go, the truth about aperture. And hopefully from this video you can see that it's more about your mindset than it is about shooting wide open. Hopefully going forward from this, you can take some of these tips and ideas of things to do in your day-to-day photography to draw attention to your subject without relying on the crutch of shooting wide open. I really want to thank anyone out there who has been watching, liking, subscribing or commenting on my videos. I really do appreciate it. And after the last video, we hit 1,000 subscribers, which feels like a bit of a milestone. And I'm going to continue putting videos out at the rate of about 1 every 2 weeks. And the reason for that is that whenever I put a video out, I want to make sure it's something that adds value, something that people can learn from, or at least have some food for thought from. So I don't put out videos weekly because I don't want to commit to putting out anything else other than content that I think you can get some value from. If you've enjoyed today's video, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe so that you get notified when more content comes out. I'm always happy to answer questions or comments, so please make a note of those in the comments section below. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.